In this video, we'll talk about rule number 6 for solving equations, which says that when you even root both sides of an equation, we need to write a plus or minus, but when we odd root both sides of an equation, we don't need a plus or minus. So let's look at some examples. So in part A of example 6, I got x squared equals 64, and I can get rid of the squared by square rooting both sides. So if I square root both sides, I get square root of x squared. I get square root of 64. And when I do that, I need to put a plus or minus on one of the sides. Okay, so the left-hand side just becomes x. On the right, square root of 64 is 8, and then I got that plus or minus. So x equals plus or minus 8. And so those are our answers. And if we were to take these and plug them back into the equation, they both work. Even the negative answer, when you square the negative, it goes away and it works. So the question I want to ask about this is, when I do this, why do we get a plus or minus? When I even root both sides of the equation, why do we get a plus or minus? Okay, so the answer has to do with the fact that, so if I write that square root, so if I write the square root on this side, and I write the square root on the other side, then I have the square root of x squared here and the square root of 64 on this side. Let's say I don't put the plus or minus. Well, the square root of x squared isn't quite x. We've seen what this is before. Remember, this is absolute value of x. We get absolute value of x. And on the other side, we get 8. Square root of 64 is 8. And then I need to think about, well, what number, when I absolute value it, would give me 8? And there's two possibilities. Either x could be 8 or it could be negative 8. Okay, so that is actually why the plus or minus shows up. When I do this step where I square root both sides, it actually produces an absolute value. And when we get rid of the absolute value, that's where the plus or minus comes from. But usually we don't do all those steps where we get that absolute value and then we get rid of the absolute value. We just remember, oh, when I square root both steps, we need to put a plus or minus. Okay, all right, so let's do another example. In B, I got x to the third equals 64. I got an odd power this time. So I can get rid of it by cube rooting both sides. Cube root the left and cube root the right. So I get cube root of x to the third equals cube root of 64. Okay, and on the left, when I cube root x to the third, I'll just get x. And the cube root of 64 is 4, but I don't need a plus or minus when I take an odd root of both sides. This is the only answer. In fact, if I were to think about, well, would negative 4 work? Well, if I cube negative 4, it'll give me negative 64, and that's not what I want. Okay, all right, let's do another example. So part C here, I'm going to skip, but I'll work out part D. So part D is a little step up in difficulty. Okay, so this time I got x to the 4 minus 1, that quantity being squared, equaling 5. So let's first try to get rid of the square. Let's square root both sides. So that's going to give us x to the 4 minus 1 on the left if I square root it. On the right, I'll get square root of 5, but I got to put a plus or minus. Okay, now I have two possibilities. So if I add the 1 over, one possibility is x to the 4 equals 1 plus root 5. The other possibility is x to the 4 equals 1 minus square root of 5. Okay. So in this first one, with the plus square root of 5, now I just got to get rid of that fourth power. So to get rid of that fourth power, I can fourth root both sides. So if I fourth root both sides, I get x on the left. I get fourth root of 1 plus square root of 5 here. But I even rooted this thing, so I need to put another plus or minus. So I get plus or minus there. Okay, what about with the other one? So what about with this one, 1 minus root 5? Well, this one's a bit different. So this one, there's something I want to notice about 1 minus root 5 and what type of number it is. So let's get a feel for how big this number is. So if I think about square root of 5, I want to think about, well, what two nice square roots is it in between? So square root of 5 is bigger than square root of 4, and it's smaller than square root of 9. And square root of 4 is 2, square root of 9 is 3. So that means square root of 5 is like 2 point something. And if I do 1 minus 2 point something, that's going to be a negative number. That is going to be a negative number. So I have x to the 4 equals a negative number, but that can't have a solution. That's going to have no solution, since if I have an even power, if I have x to the 4, that's got to be greater than or equal to 0. That's got to be non-negative. So there's no way it can be equal to a negative value. Okay, so we had to be a little careful there. All right, so overall, I end up with just the answer plus or minus 4th root of 1 plus square root of 5. So I have to be careful about that when I'm even rooting both sides and make sure I'm not actually even rooting a negative number.